Bonjour à tous, nous attendons, nous allons bientôt démarrer, nous attendons que les derniers participants se connectent et d'ici 1 à 2 minutes, nous allons démarrer ce webinaire. Merci. Bien, je vous propose de démarrer. Bienvenue à ce nouveau webinaire fait conjointement avec notre partenaire LDRA et qui va traiter aujourd'hui des nouveautés autour des règles MISRA et du standard MISRA. Aujourd'hui, je suis accompagné par Andrew Banks, qui est spécialiste et chairman MISRA au sein de LDRA. Moi-même, je suis donc Frédéric Maraval, responsable produit au sein de ISIT, et je jouerai essentiellement le rôle de modérateur pour ce webinaire. Avant de commencer, quelques informations pratiques sur le déroulé de ce webinaire. Donc, cette session sera, comme d'habitude, enregistrée. Vous pourrez accéder à la vidéo à la fin du webinaire. Durant toute la session, vous serez en mode muet. Par contre, vous pouvez à tout instant interagir avec nous au travers du canal questions que vous devez avoir disponible dans votre panneau de contrôle GoToWebinar. Donc, n'hésitez pas de poser vos questions à travers ce canal sans attendre la fin du webinaire et la session Q&A. N'hésitez pas au moment de les poser. Ce qui peut être très utile pour nous, c'est lorsque vous posez vos questions, si ça fait référence à une slide particulière, de noter le numéro de la slide. Ça permet d'avoir des réponses plus précises. Et à la fin de ce webinaire, un petit sondage vous sera envoyé. C'est 2-3 questions qui nous permettent d'avoir un retour sur le webinaire et d'améliorer nos événements. Donc, je vous remercie par avance d'y répondre. Et pour entrer dans le vif du sujet, pourquoi nous avons traité aujourd'hui l'aspect MISRA? Tout simplement, initialement, ce standard qui était plutôt dans le métier automotive, c'est largement diffusé et devenu très important. Et aujourd'hui, il est multisectoriel. Et il y a eu énormément d'évolutions sur ce standard qui était initialement orienté safety, mais de plus en plus également à intégrer les parties cybersécurité. Et dans les mois qui viennent de passer, il y a eu un grand nombre de nouveautés au niveau du MISRA, que ce soit MISRA 2023 et aujourd'hui la dernière révision MISRA 2025 qu'on souhaitait vous présenter en fait. Et également ce qui va arriver et les tendances à venir au niveau du MISRA C++. Et pour répondre à toutes ces avancées et nouveautés, je vais donner la main à Andrew qui va vous faire la présentation. So Andrew, I give you the ball. Let me just give you the right. And it is up to you.
Merci beaucoup, Frédéric. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Andrew Banks en LDRA en Angleterre. Je m'excuse, cette présentation c'est en anglais. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining. I will say it in English just in case my French was really bad. This presentation, I apologize, will be in English because my French is not good enough. So in this session, we'll discuss MISRA C 2025 and what's new. But first, about me. For those who I've not met before, I've been in this industry for over 35 years now, most of that as a developer, developing real-time embedded software systems across a number of industries: aerospace, defense, automotive, medical. And as part of that, I've picked up a few qualifications over the years. For the last 7 or 8 years, I've been with LDRA, where my role is now making sure that our clients do their job properly rather than me doing the job properly. I've been chair of MISRA C since 2013, a member of the working group since 2007, and I'm also very active in other standards, including the ISO Software and Systems Engineering subcommittee, and one of my activities at the moment is as project editor of 29119 Part 15 on static analysis. And I'm also involved with things like functional safety, 26262, and so on and so on. So you will note that these slides are actually on a MISRA set. So these are a subset of a official MISRA presentation I've done a couple of times, and so as chair of MISRA C, I'm allowed to say some things that other members are not supposed to talk about when we go through. So maybe when we get to the Q&A, that will leave you some good questions to ask. So as you hopefully will know, MISRA C has had a good steady evolution from the first edition in 1998, when it was created as the guidelines for the use of the C language in vehicle-based software. So MISRA started out life as a group of the UK's automotive industry, and the guidance was originally targeted at vehicle software. Once that was published, one of the first questions that was asked of MISRA is there an equivalent of MISRA C for the medical industry? And after much head scratching and, well, why can't you use MISRA C? The answer being because it says vehicle software on the front. The second edition followed a few years later. And while this improved and enhanced the guidance, probably the most important change was on the front cover, where it was retitled Guidelines for the Use of the C Language in Critical Systems. So that's any use of the C language where it is a fundamental requirement that the software works. So yes, safety critical, but also security critical, business critical, or any other where the application of the program is so important. A third edition followed in 2012, actually early 2013. That introduced the newer, at the time, version of the C standard, C99, which most organizations had standardized on in their development. A few years later, we added some additional guidelines that for various reasons were tagged the additional security updates, and a TC followed in 2017. This was then consolidated into a revised version of MISRA C that was published in February 2019. This should have said MISRA C 2019 on the front cover, but the person editing it forgot to change the cover. That was me, so it was my fault. So unofficially, the 2019 reprint, although it's called MISRA C 2012 First Revision, is unofficially now known as MISRA C 2019. That's very unofficially. So after 2012, there was a period, or after that revised version in 2019, there was then a fairly intense period where we produced a number of amendments to add in the C11 and C18 versions of the standard. We published these as amendments because, having just published or printed 4,000 copies of the book in 2019, we didn't want to have to start pulping those straight away. So over the next 4 years, 3 amendments and a TC were published, which were then consolidated into MISRA C 2023, which was published in 2023, although that says 2013 there. That's a typo on my screen. 2023 was, of course, the 25th anniversary of the publication of the first edition of MISRA C. And then this year, we've published an updated version in March, MISRA C 2025, and that's clearly the basis of today's discussion. So MISRA C 2023 was published in 2023 as a 25th anniversary edition, consolidating the work of the previous 4 years. The master plan at that time was that the next version would take 3, possibly 4 years to incorporate the new C standard, which was expected to be published early in 2023. For one reason or another, there was substantial delay within the publication process at ISO, and in fact, this was not actually published until the 31st of October 2024. So the nickname of C23 was a bit wrong by then. In the interim, we'd been working on a number of revisions to the guidelines, and because of this ongoing delay and our workings that it was going to be 3, maybe 4 years before that would be complete, we decided that we would roll up the changes we had in the pipeline and create a new document in 2025. This was quite straightforward because with MISRA C 2023, we'd moved to a PDF and print on demand process through Amazon. So there wasn't a cupboard full of books that we would have to throw away. So MISRA C 2025 was therefore published at Embedded World in Nuremberg this year. So a future edition or revision of MISRA C, which for all intents and purposes we will talk about as MISRA C 20XX. The likelihood is it will be 202X, but you never know. That will incorporate the new version of the C standard, which is officially known as ISO IEC 9899-2024. Now, we'll address a little conflict between us and Working Group 14 that managed the C standard. They insist on calling it C23. In MISRA, we refer to standards by the publication date. So we will refer to 9899-2024 as C24. Robert Secord, the chair of WG14, doesn't like that. He wants us to call it 2023. But our argument is the official ISO document is dated 2024, therefore we will call it 2024. So what's changed? In this first section, we'll discuss the front material, and arguably most of this is fairly minor, and so we'll gloss over it fairly quickly, but there is one important addition in here. So we've shuffled some of what was in section 6, the introduction to the rules. So things like font styles and whatever is moved to the front of the document. Section 1.5 contains some of the material that was in section 6.9. Again, it's introduction, and a lot of it hasn't changed. An important one that has changed is regarding auto-generated code, where previously we have an appendix I that reclassified, or recategorized, I should say, a number of rules when used with autocode. The recategorization and a new category that was invented for that was actually not compliant with our own MISRA compliance work. And so we've revised that significantly, and we have created a auto-generated code guideline reclassification plan. So if you're using autocode, that's relevant. If you're not using automatically generated code, then it doesn't matter. But MISRA compliance doesn't allow you, for example, to recategorize required rules, whereas Appendix I did. It disapplied some of the required rules that's not allowed. So the GRP connected with the permits document that we'd previously published now makes a MISRA compliant approach of how to deal with auto-generated code. The rest is minor and not really anything to worry about. Section 6, which was the introduction to the rules and such like, as I mentioned, has been restructured. It's actually all been renumbered as well, because we had 3 placeholder sections, 3, 4, and 5, from where we removed MISRA compliance material when we created MISRA compliance. We'd left the section headings because the amendment document said remove this section. So now we're creating a whole new version. We've removed those placeholders that basically had no content. So section 6 we've reordered to a more coherent classification. So it defines things before it uses them. But within those, actually, there's very little technical change. The terminology of the definition of mandatory required advisory is tweaked to align with MISRA compliance, and we are now adding the new category of disapplied. This has been mentioned in MISRA compliance for well, since 2018, 2016, but this is the first time we've actually included it into MISRA C itself, for reasons that will become apparent fairly soon. So now into the more interesting stuff. With the headline, there are 4 new guidelines, 3 where we've renumbered, 2 we've deleted, actually we've merged them into other guidelines. We have disapplied 1, hence the requirement for using disapplied, and then 69 other guidelines have had changes, and we'll go into those in a little while. So of those 69, 12 are normative, and these mostly relate to feedback from usage and or our interpretation of the guideline. 55 are informative or editorial, and 2 purely editorial. So of those 55, 25 revised the references, 20 only revised the examples, 4 revise the references and the examples. 1 revises a reference and removes a see also. That's for one of the deleted. 1 revises a reference and then makes an additional editorial. 3 revise the rationale. The rationale is informative. And 1 adds a new see also to a new guideline. And then the editorials, I won't say the word trivial, but they're very, very minor. So common questions that we've thought about here. Why so many changes to the references? So if we go back to this one here, 25, 29, 30, 31 rules we've changed the references. And mostly this relates to the implementation defined behaviors and also some of the additional undefined behaviors and unspecified that were added by C18. So the implementation defined in MISRA C, we'd linearly numbered them from 1. This is a long-standing numbering, but actually we decided that we ought to number them in the same way we do for C99 onwards, which is with reference to the appendix. So that changed 15, I think, of the rules. Also, we had a policy view that because the appendix in the C standard for undefined behavior and unspecified behaviors is a bulleted list, and we numbered the bullets, that we would only use the baseline standard. C18 was effectively a corrigendum of C11, and so we only annotated the additional ones with an asterisk. Unfortunately, this meant that several of the rules that we added in C23, particularly around the multi-threading, where the original behavior was not listed in the appendix, we had behaviors, multiple behaviors that were just numbered with an asterisk. And this got really confusing. And so we've decided to give each of those asterisks a unique ID for clarity. For C25, these are added as A to F, for example, of the behaviors added between 196 and 197. For C24, the situation gets a lot easier because the standard actually numbers the appendix. This was a request from MISRA that Working Group 14 actually have implemented. And so for future, we won't be the ones having to make up the numbering system. But it did mean that for 2025, quite a few of the references were changed for on an editorial basis, not a technical. Similarly with the examples, there's a lot of examples were changed. The main reason for these, and actually for most of them, is because we've had a change of policy. So previously, Directive 4.6, which specifies that you should use sized information for your types. So use int32t rather than int, and int64t rather than long, for example. Directive 4.6 also said to use float32t for float and float64t for double. With changes that are coming in to C24 and subsequently, there are going to be a whole load more new floating point types. Float and double themselves are implementation defined. And so enforcing the use of float32t and float64t didn't actually solve any problems. Arguably, it caused problems. So for MISRA C 2025, we've now removed the requirement to use sized float type defs. That impacted every example that touched on floating point. Also, as an editorial tidy up, there were a number of examples that used studlib to get the definition of null. Studlib.h is only available in hosted environments, and so we've modified those to always use studdef.h, which is available in all implementations. So again, just tidying up things to make sure that they're applicable in all circumstances. So what are our 4 new guidelines? So firstly, tentative declarations shall not be made in a header file. In practice, what this means is every declaration in a header file should have the extern keyword on the front of it. If it isn't intended to be a global and therefore extern variable, and there are some use cases, therefore a deviation from this may be used, should always be static to define the scope, and they should always be complete definitions. Related to that is a new rule that says external declarations should not be made in a source file. So the extern keyword should not appear in a C file. So externs are used to define the external interface, and therefore that should be declared in a header file that is included elsewhere. You shouldn't need to just drop a random extern function or extern object in a source file to make reference to an external. That implies that you haven't got your file structure correct. That one is advisory, but we would strongly recommend its adoption. 11.11 pointers shall not be implicitly compared to null. So this comes from, we had a line in the introductory text to the 10.x rules, the essential type model, that made a comment that the rules in this section do not apply to pointers unless otherwise specified. And then in rule 10.1, there was a reference to checking for null in against pointers that actually had very little connection to the rest of rule 10.1. So we removed that out of 10.1. We removed the exception unless otherwise specified, so that the essential type model only applies to non-pointer objects. Then you have the 11.x that apply to pointers. So to fill the gap, we have created an advisory rule covering the requirement that was in 10.1 that pointers shall not be implicitly compared to null. So that's like if you have a pointer PTR, you don't just do if PTR do something, you should put if pointer not equal to null. Simple as that. And this is just to make sure you're highlighting that you know what you're doing and you're referring to the pointer rather than the contents of the pointer. And this is quite a common mistake that people make, where they think they're looking at the value of the pointer and they're actually checking the contents of the pointer, or the other way around, and you end up with erroneous failure to check for null pointer dereferencing. And then the fourth new rule is 19.3. So MISRA has a general recommendation not to use unions, and the reason for that is well defined, because unions are poorly defined. but we've added a required rule on top of that advisory to say a union member shall not be read unless it's been previously set. So explicitly, you should only read the version of the union that you've written to. Now, there is an exception in here if your union is of an object unioned with an array of unsigned char, because unsigned char will pack to the right size. And that's a very common used paradigm for things like communication buffers and such like. So there is an exception for a very common use case, but then the rule applies to those where the use of unions is very undefined or unspecified in the standard. We've renumbered 3. Rule 1.2 has been renumbered to be a directive. And this was after a lot of thought. The use of language extensions should be minimized. It's not really a enforceable rule. The subset or the set of language extensions is completely indeterminable. And so statically, all this one could do would be to flag things that were known to be language extensions, but it couldn't be a complete set. And therefore, we decided that it was more appropriate for that one to be a directive rather than the rule. We then moved 21.2 and 21.1 out of the standard library section into the identifiers and the preprocessor section, respectively. So 21.2 becomes 5.10 and 21.1 becomes 20.15. We have deleted 2 guidelines. So in the 11.4 and 11.7 section were 2 guidelines that were very related. One was for arithmetic objects and one was for non-arithmetic objects. For other work, which we'll touch on in a moment, the distinction between the 2 got even more blurry. And the main difference between the 2, which was that 11.7 was required and 11.4 was advisory, we actually changed 11.4 to be required. At which point we looked and thought, there's actually no point having 2 separate rules here. So we've actually merged the 2 and just reformulated what was left of 11.7 into 11.4. Similarly, with 11.5 and 11.6, we had 2 rules that dealt with the parameter declaration where it was an array type. One was required, one was mandatory. We then came up with use cases where the mandatory rule may need to be deviated, but you can't deviate mandatory rules. So that meant we would need to recategorize the mandatory rule to be required. You've now got 2 required rules that very, very closely interact. So again, we've combined the 2 as a single required rule. We've then disapplied one guideline. And I have to say, this has caused a lot of anguish in the functional safety community for reasons I don't quite understand. And I've tried to explain and propose that 26262 and 61508 actually edit themselves rather than moan that MISRA have downgraded this rule. So Rule 15.5 requires that functions have a single point of exit at the end. So where it returns a value, return shall be the last line of the function and returns a value there. Functions, according to this directive, are not allowed to return early. Now, having early returns to return error information, for example, where parameters are invalid or error conditions occur, makes for much simpler, clearer code. And the way compilers work, even if you have early return statements, they implement that by a common exit point anyway. So it was our view that this directive had ceased to have any legitimacy or value, but in deference to the fact that 26262 and 61508 have a requirement that maps to this, we have downgraded or recategorized 15.5 from advisory to disapplied. So by default, it does not apply. If you're using 26262 or 61508, you can recategorize that back to advisory or even required if you so wish. But we've kept it so they can do that, but we think it's not necessary to do it. So I mentioned 11.4 and 11.7 earlier. Previously, we didn't mention the int pointer or uint pointer T types. This was deliberate, as we didn't think there was anything that needed to be mentioned when we did the C11, C18 changes. However, we had a number of questions about the use of uint pointer. So we've modified rules 11.3 to tweak the rationale to explain why that rule is what it is. 11.4 and 11.6, we have revised the rationale and added an exception for the conversion to and or from int pointer and uint pointer with examples. 11.4, as I've mentioned, we've recategorized as required. And then consequentially, we've deleted 11.7 and made some additional tweaks to make sure that all the issues covered by 11.7 are clearly covered by 11.4. So hopefully that means we've now got a better rule that's more clearly defined, but also covers int pointer T and uint pointer T. .5 says you cannot convert void star to a pointer to object. This is the case even where the standard library function returns a void star. So a deviation would be required. We've added an exception to this to permit the immediate conversion of a pointer returned from the dynamic memory allocation functions. So that's malloc, calloc, realloc. This does not affect the general MISRA policy that dynamic memory allocation should not be used. So if you are using malloc, calloc, whatever, you still need a deviation against Directive 412 and Rule 21.3. But we decided that it seemed churlish to insist on deviating 11.5 as well if you've documented the reasons why you want to use dynamic memory. Switch statements. So previously we required every switch clause to have a break statement at the end. This included a clause that was terminated by a go to or a continue or a call to a no return function, which meant that that break was flagged as unreachable code. Having a rule that requires unreachable code and therefore a Rule 2.2 violation is a bit of a mistake, and we've been pondering how to deal this for quite a while. At first, we decided we would just have an exception to Rule 2.2 and say a break statement is not flagged as unreachable, but that's a bit rubbish. So what we've done is we've thought about our definition and structure of switch statements, and we now permit or require the termination of each switch clause to be either a break or to permit a go to, a continue, or a call to no return. So that's a properly thought through solution to the problem of our own making. And hopefully that will be supported by the community. Rule 14.4 on infinite loops. Previously, we simply said invariants that are used to create infinite loops are permitted. And what this meant was you'd find all sorts of fairly complex invariant terms, some of which were not intended to be invariant, and therefore code that should have been caught by 14.3 was not, because tools were saying, that's an invariant, that's permitted. So we've tightened up 14.3 and specified 3 specific forms that are permitted. That is the empty for clause, a while true, or a do while true. Simple as that. So you will no longer be allowed to put for 7 equals 7 or for x equals y, where you've previously defined x equals y, x equals y and things like this. So again, it's to make it abundantly clear this is intended to be an infinite loop, not, oops, it's an accidental infinite loop. (20.7) previously required macro parameters to be parenthesized. Sometimes parentheses were not the right delimiters. So you might have wanted or needed to use square brackets or even braces or a comma. So we've revised 20.7 so it now says macro parameters shall be appropriately delimited with additional clarification. It doesn't necessarily require that all parameters themselves are delimited in the expansion. It's acceptable that delimiters to be provided in the arguments themselves. So it's when the code is expanded, the parameters need to be delimited appropriately. For most people, this wasn't a problem, and the revised version should not be a problem either, but there were some specific use cases where this was a problem. Then there's a couple of other tweaks that are fairly minor. So 10.1, I've already mentioned, removing pointers from scope, linking to the new 11.1. 17.3, that previously we just made applicable to C90. The problem itself can occur in later standards because some compilers permit and continue to permit implicit declarations. These are all fairly minor. Then within the appendices, again, not a huge amount of change. Withdrawn guideline is a new subsection to list those that are deleted or renumbered. Appendix D on the essential types, there is some removal of overlap between what was in Appendix D and Section 8.10 on essential types. So we've rationalized it so there's no duplication. As I mentioned, the appendix on autocode is revised to reference the guideline recategorization plan. Appendix H on undefined and uncritical unspecified behavior. Both of those have been updated, A, to reflect the changes in the guidelines, but also to correct some errors and omissions. And the example deviation record placeholder, that's another legacy from the 2023 change, has been deleted. So the glossary is now Appendix I, and the change log is up to Appendix J. And obviously that's been completely refreshed for MISRA C 2025. So as well as the core MISRA C document, there are a number of documents, or addendums as we call them, that are part of a supporting cast. So addendum 1 was a mapping of MISRA C 2004 to 2012, and that was published when we first published MISRA C 2012. That hasn't changed, and we're not updating it, so there's no new version of that. Mapping of the ISO C Secure standard that was created as part of our security updates was refreshed for MISRA C 2023, published at the end of 2024. There are no changes to that, so we have not yet updated that, but we will keep it in mind should there need to be any changes. Similarly, the mapping of MISRA to Cert C, we published an updated version of that against C 2023 early this year, and again that carries forward into 2025. And then a fairly new mapping of the ISO language vulnerability standard was published in October 2024. Again, there are no changes identified for 2025, so that will carry forward. Then there are 2 documents that were published at Embedded World this year, which is the start of mapping MISRA C excuse me, to the CWE Common Weakness Enumeration. So we published the first version of that, which covers the memory safety parts of CWE, thus showing that actually MISRA covers all of the memory safety issues relating to C. Memory safety is a very high profile issue, and a lot of it boils down to people misusing C and failing to follow the requirements to actually include your own runtime checks. So C trusts the programmer, and if you abuse that trust, that's where mistakes happen. So first mapping of CWE, and that will be evolved over time to cover further parts of the CWE range. And then interesting one just is we have a mapping of the MISRA rules to Rust, and this has been contributed to a number of the various Rust activities that are ongoing at the moment. There are 2 other documents that are in this set. I've already mentioned one of them, the permits document. That was published in 2021 for MISRA C 2012. We haven't yet added to that, but it's one that we're constantly keeping under review. And then I've already mentioned it a couple of times, the GRP for autocode. We published a version of that for MISRA C 2023 and for the new 2025 at Embedded World this year. Which brings me to the end of this short presentation. I hope you found that interesting, and I'm quite happy now to take questions. And again, I apologize, but in English, please, or at least Frederick would have to translate if they were in French. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. No problem. You can write your question in French. I will translate. Thank you very much for your presentation, Andrew. Donc, n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions. Il y a déjà quelques questions qui ont été présentées en français ou en anglais. Je traduirai. Il y a pas de souci. Par contre, je discuterai avec Andrew en anglais, bien entendu. So, Andrew, the first question: can we use MISRA C 2025 for 323?
The long and short answer is you can, but there is a lot of on your own head be it. So you could use MISRA C 2025 for all the bits of C23 that are already in C18. So if you were familiar with the Amendment 2 that we did as part of the series of changes from 2012 to 2023, we added a rule 1.4 that basically said don't use any of the new features. So if you were to constrain yourself by that, you would need to deviate MISRA to say I'm using C 2023/2024, which would be a deviation against against section 1.3, and any use of the new features would fall within the scope of rule 1.1, which specifies the version of the C standard that you're using. So yes, you can, but if you aren't using any of the new features, then you may as well be using C18 anyway. But if you really want to use C23/24, then maybe it's worth having a conversation and we can give you some specific guidance of how to go about that.
Thank you. Second one, I hope I will translate it correctly. What was the point of renumbering rules 21.1 and 21.2, and will those numbers be reused?
So the second part is easy. No, we will not reuse any of the numbers that we've either renumbered a rule out of the way or deleted. They will be retired forevermore. The reason we renumbered them is we're working on enhanced guidance for the standard library, and virtually everything within the 21.x and 22.x sections only relate to hosted implementations. The two rules that we've moved, we felt they were in the wrong place anyway, so use of hash define ought to be in preprocessor because that's a preprocessor directive, and the rule about declaring identifiers that are listed in the standard is an identifier related rule. So moving those two out the way means that the rest of the 21.x and 22.x rules only relate to the hosted environment. And as we work on those and produce additional guidelines, we may be looking at how we restructure that whole section. So it's a change that we're making in preparation for future changes.
Thank you, Andrew. Regarding, as we are close to the end of the webinar, maybe one of the last question, interesting one. Is MISRA doing anything about Rust?
Yes. So as you saw, if I come back a slide, Addendum 6, we produced a mapping that shows the applicability of the MISRA guidelines to Rust. What this shows, and that's freely available to download off the MISRA C website. So you can just go to misra.org.uk on publications and you can just download that. And what this shows is quite a few of the MISRA rules. In fact, we were surprised how many actually are applicable to Rust. And this has been contributed to several different Rust working groups, all of whom have identified the requirement for something like a MISRA Rust. Whether MISRA produce this or we support one of the other working groups producing it is still under discussion. So the long answer, or the short answer is yes, we are doing something. The long answer is, but we're not entirely sure what it will be, what form it will be, and when it will be. So maybe I'll do another one of these talks in a year's time, and maybe I might have an answer then, but I can't promise.
Thank you very much. And so the last one, when can we expect the next version of MISRA to be published, and is it worthwhile upgrading to 2025?
Okay, two parts to the question again. So I'll deal with the second part first. If you are in a project that's already using MISRA C, it may not be worth upgrading to 2025 just yet. But that depends how far back and which version you're already using. If you're starting a new project and your tool supports it, I would say start with MISRA C 2025. If you're on 2023, it's probably not worth it. If you're on 2012 or earlier, I would say upgrade. The main reason is that we will not be supporting or making changes to 2012. So if you have issues, then it'll only ever get fixed in the newest version. So yes and no. Again, I'm happy to take a question offline to discuss that. Excuse me. In terms of when the next version will be, as I put in an early slide, we're calling it MISRA C 20XX. The likelihood is it will be 202X, but it may not be. It really boils down to we will publish it when we're ready. I would think a minimum of 3 years, mostly because people don't want us to be publishing something every 2 years. So I would say a minimum of 3 years. 2028 happens to be the 30th anniversary of MISRA C. So maybe 2028, but it may be 2029, it may be 2030. At this stage, it's too early to say for definite. All I can say is it will not be 2026 unless somebody finds something really, really wrong with 2025. But even then, you know, that would probably be just an errata rather than a new version. So probably 2028 or 2029 would be my guess at this point. But that's just an idea. It's certainly not a commitment at this point.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we will conclude this webinar, so I will switch to French. Merci à vous de votre participation. Comme je l'ai indiqué en début de webinaire, vous devriez avoir un petit sondage qui va suivre. Je vous remercie par avance d'y répondre. Ça me permet d'avoir un retour sur l'intérêt que vous avez eu de ce webinaire. J'espère que les informations qui vous ont été transmises vous ont été utiles. Pour les questions qui restent en suspens, on reviendra en privé directement avec vous par mail. Merci encore pour votre participation. Vu l'horaire, je vous souhaite un bon appétit et une très bonne journée et je vous dis à très bientôt. Merci à vous, bonne journée. Au revoir.